Okay, so we're on right now. Okay, so right now I am live broadcast as part of an interview process with Dr. Baca. Can you introduce yourself real quick?
Introduction. Damian Baca, Associate Professor, Department of English, University of Arizona. Currently Director of the program in Rhetoric, Composition, and the Teaching of English. Also working with the Breadloaf School of English in Santa Fe, New Mexico, here in summer 2016.
Cool. Well, thank you for joining us today. And we look very forward to, I guess, listening to your narrative about joining the caucus and your participation in the caucus. So we're just going to get started with our first question today. The first question today is, when and why did you choose to attend SEAS or the NCTE, or both?
I joined the Latino Caucus and the 4Cs in 2000. It was the 4Cs Minneapolis Convention in the year 2000. I was a graduate student in the master's program at Northern Arizona University. And I'm aware that I'm not first generation, that there are several who have come before me in the organization. But as a graduate student getting a master's degree at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, I was feeling very much like first generation, in that I was the first Latino to attend the rhetoric master's program, which was new, with the intent of eventually earning the PhD and moving on into the office of the professoriate. So I was the first Latino that the faculty that I was working with in the graduate program, it was, I guess you could say, you could describe it as first contact. It was not their first contact with Latinos. There were a number of Latinos in as custodial staff at the university. The cafeteria was well staffed with Latinos. But having a Latino show up in class, interested in a master's degree in rhetoric and composition for the purposes of attaining a PhD in rhetoric and composition, that was very new for the faculty that I was working with. Also problematic was growing up in New Mexico, having Spanglish as my first language, having acclimated to standardized American English at a fairly early age. There wasn't much for faculty to do for me regarding fixing me linguistically, and that was another challenge for faculty. And then also being being güerito from New Mexico, being this light-skinned Mexican, I didn't conform to the conventional stereotypical expectations of an ethnographic encounter with Mexicans. So it was very much first contact, and I felt very much like first generation. And so coming to the 4Cs was only further alienating. And it was the Latino Caucus that I discovered fairly quickly, was my institutional home, my emotional home, a place of support and a sense of belonging. And of course, this is under Ceci Milanes was the Latino Caucus chair at that time. And so I was interested in language because I know that you've asked about the interest in rhetoric and composition. So I was interested in language and identity formation, historical memory, and also the physical, corporal, act of writing. But it was alarming to me that the majority of the sources that were used to inform rhetoric and composition came primarily from Hellenocentric, Eurocentric, North Atlantic, Western civilizations that really had very little beyond a 200-year history. I was thinking of primarily of Enlightenment. So yes, rhetoric and composition studies the Greeks, but they study them through Hegel. So we're really learning very little, I think, about the Greeks of the 4th century BCE in the ancient Mediterranean, and we were learning more about Hegel and Hegelian visions of the intellectual kidnapping of ancient Greece as a cradle of Western civilization, that myth. So we were being asked, all of us, regardless of where we came from in the classroom at the graduate level, we were being asked to take on the skin and the mentality of Eurocentrism. And so on one hand, I was interested in rhetoric and composition, but on the other hand, the lenses that the field continues to use, I felt to be highly damaging and destructive. And I think that the role of the Latino Caucus at the Seas has been incredibly important to me. And I would especially like to note the role of the Latino Caucus working with former NCTE employee Dr. Sandra Gibbs, who placed diversity at the forefront of all of the work that we do, of our teaching, our research, our outreach, our community engagement, and a recognition that as we pursue these goals, that we are not alone, that we are working parallel to other groups, other scholars, other teachers of color who are also asking and demanding change. And so it was Sandra Gibbs who was a very important point person for us, for the Latino Caucus, in our interactions with and correspondence with the other caucuses of color, the co-chairs and chairs of the other caucuses of color, was incredibly important. It's interesting about the vision of the Latino Caucus at the time under Ceci Milanes, because her work, of course, she comes to the world of language and text through the lens of creative writing, of poetry, and her work has been a huge inspiration to me. I always read it and engaged it as and saw that clearly this is rhetoric. This can tell us much about rhetorical theory, and it reveals much about composition and composing strategies and the craft of writing. So Ceci's work has always been stretching beyond borders, beyond disciplinary borders. But I was aware at the same time that the field of rhetoric and composition didn't take her work into account. And so it was very clear to me the policed borders of what counts as rhetoric and composition and what does not. Those borders are still heavily policed, even as the field claims itself as a transdisciplinary field. I don't think we've really reached that. I think we call ourselves a field. I'm not sure if that's something that the intellectual work has earned that designation. And so Ceci's work has really broadened my horizons and was, I think, very important to me. And we think about her vision coming in, again, crossing borders, conventional borders. So even we could ask the question of who is Latino, what counts as Latina and Latino, who is in and who is out. The Latino caucus under Ceci, and I know this before, even before her, had a fluidity, and I believe it still does, of accommodating, of welcoming, of including people who actually may not. I'm thinking Gail Okawa would have been one figure that comes to mind. Other members of the Latino caucus who've been part of our community, who may or may not have identified with this subjectivity of the marker of Latina and Latino. And so Ceci's vision was, I think, very important. And I hope that the Latino caucus will continue to be embracing those fluid categories and thinking across conventional barriers for solidarity.
And so, what do you think?
My goals at the time?
Yeah, your goals.
Sure. Well, one goal was just to get myself into a PhD program that would allow me for options after. So as a first-generation college student and a first-generation graduate student, first in my family to earn a college degree, first in my family to go on to graduate school, I had quite a bit of catch-up to do, and learning from a few faculty in my undergraduate degree in Texas about peer institutions, about feeder schools, about national rankings, learning about those institutional hierarchies was very informative. And also looking at the labor practices, the hiring practices of universities, and in particular in English departments, which is not all that encouraging. But I did recognize early on that as a young punk kid, Manito from New Mexico, if I had any intention of returning to New Mexico and returning to this part of the world, that actually heading outward and getting a PhD far beyond my own regional sense of place, that may enable a possibility of returning somewhere close to home. And so that's I ended up finding myself at Syracuse, where again I'm very aware that I am not first generation within the caucus, but I was first generation in that first student of color in the Syracuse CCR program, Composition and Cultural Rhetoric program. And again, that moment of first contact, I was a great ethnographic disappointment.
Okay. So when you joined the caucus, how many people were involved at that time? And what do you think was the sentiment of being involved at the caucus or with the caucus at the C's when you were there?
Under Ceci, we continued to grow as a caucus. Our numbers continued to grow. They were not the numbers that we see now. I'm thinking of the numbers at the Latino caucus at the 4 C's in Houston, 2016, just this past April. That would have to be the largest caucus meeting I have seen and that's in a 10-year period of time. So, or a little over, so at least 12 or more years. So there is significant growth beyond what we've seen. There have been years at NCTE. 10 years ago, I went to one Latino caucus meeting in Minneapolis at NCTE, and there were 4 of us in the room. There were just 4. Now, there were more Latinos at the convention that year, but they were also spread in multiple directions. Not everyone can always get to those meetings. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. So sometimes, on some years, our numbers would be very small, very small. But I think that we're moving beyond that. I think that the days of the Latino caucus coming in and being able to count those in attendance on one or two hands. I think that we've exhausted that era, and we've moved on. We've moved beyond it. So there are many of us in every state, in every region of the country.
So when you joined at the time, what were some of the issues that you witnessed or observed at the Cs, in the caucus, and how do you remember the caucus responding to some of those issues? Or you yourself responding?
One of the first things that I noticed that was a great disappointment to me at 4Cs are panels that are presumably celebrating diversity, and you would see one scholar would be a prominent, one of the few prominent voices in African American rhetorical traditions. She would be there. Next to her, you'd have a scholar who does Asian American rhetoric and Asian American rhetorical traditions. Again, one of a very small number of people. She would be there. The next one, the next presenter, she would be presenting on disability. Still a small circulation of scholars, which is growing. And then the fourth member would be someone who is taken from literature, someone taken from another field to speak for and represent Latina and Latino rhetorical traditions. And on one hand, that could be seen as a strength. But if we look at hiring practices, and if we look carefully at the pipeline, that actually speaks to a significant systemic problem. And that is the underrepresentation of Latinos and the underrepresentation of Latina scholars, in particular, women of Mexican American descent, women of Puerto Rican descent. There are very, very few women, even today, right now, in 2016, if we were to count the number of scholars in rhetoric and composition who are Latina, who have tenure. We're talking about people, I would probably count them on one hand right now. We're talking about very few. So I observed this at the very beginning, that if you're looking for a Latino or a Latina who does scholarship in rhetoric and composition, who is publishing for other scholars in rhetoric and composition on Latino rhetoric and Latino composition practices, then the 4Cs is not the place to go. It's not the place for you. So what I had noticed, I could only describe as absence, erasure, and no significant or sustained attempt to fix that situation, to tend to that, and to promote change. And so the caucus has been well aware, and so that sense of dread, those moments of hopelessness, I think it was important for us to be able to go, even when we were in small in number, to attend the Latino caucus and to be able to share those moments with each other, as well as planning ahead, planning for the future, and thinking not simply what is the next step, but what are thinking 2 to 3 steps out. How do we want to see ourselves begin making change and affecting, everlasting, change in the field, in the discipline. It's very interesting about my own relationship with the Cs, because some of my work, as you know, does touch on questions of rhetoric, history, and historiography. Although I wouldn't describe my work as necessarily rhetorical historiography, although it certainly touches on that and certainly speaks into the Eurocentric limits of what passes itself off as history of rhetoric in our field. I don't see that the field has been all that responsive to, for example, in mestizo scripts, digital migrations in the territories of writing. I am attempting to retell the story of rhetoric and writing as technologies that emerge not in Athens, because archaeologists and historians will confirm that's not where writing begins. I was telling the story of rhetoric and writing as they emerge in the Valley of Mexico, which is not something that you can really do in the expanse of a single book. But there was an ambitious attempt to engage in this sort of hermeneutic reconstruction with direct implications for the studying, the teaching, and the practicing of writing today. So the reception at the Four Seas was actually fairly cold. Oddly enough, I have been embraced by NCTE, and I will be the first to acknowledge I don't have training in English education. I don't try to pass myself off as something that I am not, but they have been overwhelmingly supportive, and the Latino Caucus, of course, through NCTE, has been a huge resource of support, but also NCTE's Cultivating New Voices, CNV, the Cultivating New Voices for Scholars of Color mentorship program has been incredibly helpful to me. I was part of the cohort of 2004 to 2006. And being able to work with other scholars in the field. I was the only in my cohort. This would be significant to this conversation. I was the only, I was a graduate student at the time. I was the only graduate student in rhetoric and composition. All of my colleagues in my cohort were coming from, were in a school of education, or we're focusing on English education. And so that's important, I think, to note. And so being involved in NCTE, cultivating new voices of scholars of color, has been helpful.
What, we're having a little bit of technical difficulty here, but what were some of the earliest memories that you have of the caucus interacting with other folks outside of the caucus? And what kind of discussions do you remember happening? And what kind of resolutions or projects do you feel that took place thereafter? Can you see me? Can you hear me? Please say something.
Okay, you're asking me to say something. Are you able to hear me? You can hear me okay?
I can hear you, but
I'm
you
all right.
can't hear me?
My volume is all the way up on my end.
So my next question was, what were some of your earliest memories of the caucus interacting with other people outside of the caucus? And what kind of discussions were taking place? And what kind of resolutions or projects were undertaken to address those issues?
I think one of the most significant developments that comes to my mind would have been under Christina Kirkleiter.
Mm.
And this was when NCTE lost Dr. Sandra Gibbs. So this could have been 2006, 2007, right around that period of time. And there was no transparency. We didn't know what was happening, nor were we able to really get much information. But we wanted to make sure that we communicated to the executive committee that we were concerned. And so Christina Kirkleiter and I drafted a letter to the executive committee strongly encouraging them to reconsider their decision to release her, to let her go, after I believe around 20 years of service to the organization. And I don't know the name of the letter. I will have to check with Christina Kirkleiter, and we'll be able to track that down. And so Sandra Gibbs had worked with NCTE, I believe, for about 20 years. And again, she was in network theory. She would be what we would describe as a hub. She was the connector between the Latino caucus, the African American, the Black caucus, the Asian American caucus. She was the connector across caucuses of color and caucuses of distance, of difference. And so she was someone that we relied on heavily. She would come in, we would see her during caucus meetings at the Four Cs. We would see her very briefly. She'd pop her head in, and she'd share with us very brief, necessary information about proposals that the Black Caucus was considering, for example, and considering supporting. And this was prior to executive committee meetings, and it was good for us to know ahead of time going in what our fellow peers, and colleagues, and good friends in our other caucuses are interested in supporting, so that we would have the opportunity to lend our support, to explore possibilities of displaying solidarity. So it was a very important position. And so when she was let go, I believe that she was up for retirement in a year or two. And so she was let go prior to retirement. So we don't have the whole story, but we were concerned, and we wanted to make sure that the executive committee understood our concern. There was no attempt to replace Sandra Gibbs. There was no replacement. So we were at a great loss. And so I drafted the letter with Christina Kirkleiter, and we mobilized the Latino community, and so many letters were sent. We co-wrote one of them. I know that the Black Caucus also was sending letters to the executive committee at that time. We wanted to communicate to the executive committee the importance of Sandra Gibbs. We wanted to make sure that this was made visible to them, that they understood the key role that Sandra Gibbs played in bringing issues of diversity to the table, to be taken very seriously. Right? And so other caucuses likewise were interested in questions of race, writing, rhetoric and diversity, multilingualism, questions of representation on executive committee, questions of representation on editorial boards, the conversations we're still having today. So Sandra Gibbs was the connector. We were able to communicate through her between caucuses. So we wanted to make sure that the executive committee at the time knew the value and the importance of her work. We felt that the way in which she was fired from her job was a problem. And so again, we don't know why, but this was someone who was incredibly important to us, and we weren't hearing from NCTE and the 4Cs that they were aware. That wasn't clear. So there were other caucuses participating. So it was we could describe it as a cross caucus initiative. I don't have the hard numbers, and that's something that we might be able to confirm with Christina Kirkleiter, maybe Victor Villanueva. There might be some folks in our caucus, in our community, who would be able to speak to numbers. But it was one moment that stands out in my mind of a cross caucus initiative. One of the things that I will add is at this past April 2016 in Houston at the 4Cs, there was the after caucus mixer. And this is something that I don't know who's responsible for making that happen. But I do know that there has been a push to make this happen for several years. And I've been calling for it for almost a decade. And what it started with a question. Sandra Gibbs was still with us at the time, and it started with a question of, couldn't the meeting rooms be next to each other, be adjacent to each other, near, to place them? Don't segregate and put us into like these siloed, spaces far from each other at 6 p.m., 7 p.m. at night, and the halls are empty, and you're looking for some room several floors up. That's isolating. Don't do that. Instead, take all the caucuses, especially the caucuses of color, organize meeting rooms next to each other, with the possibility of making some sort of connection after those meetings. And so, in my mind, that was actually a very minimal request, because we weren't actually asking for something else other than just the reservation of the room assignments is really what that was it. So it was, I think it was actually a fairly modest request, but it took years of asking. I remember several years ago, there was a proposal that went up, and we're not going to remember the name, of offering financial assistance to teachers and professors, instructors who were employed at tribal colleges, providing financial travel support to the seas for tribal college instructors. That initiative came up. It was proposed by Scott Lyons, one of the few indigenous scholars of rhetoric and composition, and that was went through. I believe it was unanimous. There was cross caucus support for making sure that we're supporting those teachers, those instructors who are dedicated to teaching at our tribal colleges. There's virtually no representation in our academic journals at our conferences that would account for the pedagogies, the research, the life experiences of educators at our tribal colleges. And so Scott Lyons is the one who spearheaded that, but there was support, a pronounced support from members of the Latino caucus for that. I think that there is a understandable an understandable situation where the caucuses can kind of become siloed and segregated, and there is some space where we need to meet in our own groups to discuss the immediate pressing needs of our own communities, and so we need to have that space. At the same time, there are some shared concerns. They may not be identical. So I'm not interested in flattening difference, but I think that there are connections across differences, and there are shared concerns that we can collaborate on, that we can work together. And so there has been, my perception is that there's been a bit of a siloing, an unfortunate segregation between the caucuses of color. I'd like to see that change. I'd like to see that, and I think that the Latino caucus is in a great position. I think that there's an advantage that we have precisely because we have a very fluid identity, a fluid caucus identity. And even the mission statement that we've had throughout the years, going back to under Ceci Milanes, the mission statement actually was never really targeting Latino and Latina scholars. The mission statement, the original mission statement under Ceci, targeted scholars who were committed to matters of Latina and Latino composition, and committed to Latina and Latino contributions to rhetoric and rhetorical theory, regardless of one's background. So it's always been rather inclusive, and I'd like to see it continue to move forward in working with other caucuses in that inclusive spirit. I think that there's a great deal of ambiguity when I think about how the 4Cs or NCTE has been responsive to Latino scholars and educators. I see it that it largely has not been. And I think that the one year that stands out where we could find a clear exception to that is the year of the 4Cs under Adam Banks. And so we can flip through the program schedule, and there is a very clear effort to make sure that some of the most prominent voices in the Latino caucus are featured not just in the program in concurrent sessions, but they are speaking as featured speakers, right? Featured speakers in the as keynote events. That's incredibly important, and so we actually did see a kind of diversity at that point that had been unprecedented. It's not unprecedented outside. There's an incredible amount of diversity in our schools, in our neighborhoods. Stepping into the 4Cs, that's where you see an erasure. And so under Adam Banks, we do see a shift, a significant shift. Whether or not we've been able to mirror that in the 2 years past of the 4Cs, I'm uncertain. I think we still have a ways to go. And I like to make sure that the Cs is moving in that direction. Well, I think it's when we talk about what the organization has done or hasn't done, keep in mind we're talking about an organization that has had only one Latino male, Victor Villanueva, and that was before my time. So it might have been as early as 1999 when Victor Villanueva was serving as program chair. There's been no Latina ever in the entire history of the organization, and no Latino before or since Victor. So it's very easy to point to a kind of tokenizing that we see in the field, and it's time for the field to shed that tokenism and to begin moving forward. About the caucus responding to occlusion and inclusivity. I think that the caucus has a great history of inclusivity and alliance building and solidarity. I think that it has a great history of that. I'd like to make sure that it continues to do that. Well, one is alliance building across Latina and Latino subjectivities and experiences, right? So for me, writing mestizo scripts, is coming from a very specific, northern New Mexico, perspective, and that one book simply could not account for all of the subjectivities, the histories and memories and rhetorical practices of Latina and Latino populations. No single book can do that. That's beyond the bounds of possibility. But it's one contribution to the question of if there is such a thing as a Latina and Latino rhetoric that cannot be fully articulated and accounted for and explained by Greco-Roman concepts reimagined through the lens of Enlightenment thinkers such as Hegel. If there is such a thing, which we know, of course, that to be true, but if academics were to recognize that as such, that argument would not be made in a single book. It would be made in a multitude of dissertations and books across generations, across time. Right? Mm. So one book is not enough, or the very few other book-length works that have contributed to our understanding of Latino and indigenous rhetorical traditions. I could probably count all of the books on one hand in coming from rhetoric and composition. Right. So it's important for us to be thinking about alliance building across from, and even when we talk about Mexican American and Cuban American and Dominican American relations, that's true. But we can also break down Mexican too, because do we mean Mexican as northern New Mexico, or do we mean Mexican as South Valley, Texan, right? Or do we mean Mexican as Pilsen out of Chicago, right? So even the idea of Mexican subjectivity is we're talking already about, there's a wide canvas of life experience, and so I think that there is a way of continuing to foster alliance building across our cultural differences, across our experiences. And then moving that and continuing to move beyond to looking at Afro-Latino and looking at African American and Black solidarity movements. I think the time is ripe for this kind of the crosstalk that we need to continue moving forward. But they don't want to know that there is a book at all. Acknowledging that there is a book. You know, as you probably know, that Mestizo Scripts is a highly controversial book, and people hate it. You know, so that's simply where we're at. Maybe there are other ways that I could have written it to make it more accessible. I could have, you know, asked, oh, please accommodate our difference. You know, so there could have been, I think, many more, you know, gentle and diluted calls for change that could have made it more accessible, make it less, you know, less demanding on the reader, I guess. But there are so few. There are so few books that one would turn to if they wanted to know, well, what's the story of writing as it emerges in Egypt? Well, there are books, but you are needing to turn to, you know, archaeology. If you want to know, well, what about the great painted book traditions of the Valley of Mexico? Well, you're not going to turn to rhetoric and composition for that. You're going to turn actually to art history, who will give you that history. You know, what if you want to know about the development of Sanskrit? You know, coming out of the Indus Valley several generations ago, and in what is now the border of Pakistan and India. You're not going to find that in rhetoric and composition. You know, they're not interested in that. But at the same time, they're claiming to be interested in that because they want to say, the field wants to say, that rhetoric and composition and the future of writing must be multimodal and must be multilingual. But it is precisely the multimodal and multilingual form and contributions to the field of writing that the field has systematically erased out of our histories, which is why we'd go to Greece, right? So I would characterize both NCTE and 4Cs as primarily unresponsive, right? You know, I don't know about the, you know, the vision of what the field thinks of when they think of Mexican American. They certainly don't think of me, and so I'm aware that I'm not going to be a stereotypical representation, and while simultaneously understanding that it is precisely the light-skinned, those of us in the Mexican community, those of us in the Latino community who are light-skinned, will have it better off in higher education. We'll have it easier than our dark-skinned brothers and sisters. But the vision of Mexican American in both the Cs and in CTE seems to be someone who has arrived recently, who is in desperate need of linguistic salvation that can only come from the National Council of Teachers. You know, that there's, so the literacy salvation narrative, the linguistic salvation narrative, it's still, that progress narrative is very much still part of the humanities and social sciences. It's still embedded there. And Ralph Cintrone, in the last octologue, in the third octologue, addressed this barely. And so, and he's absolutely right. We need to continue to rethink this progress narrative. So they're positioning Mexican Americans as someone who have arrived recently, and Mexican American also seems to be associated with manual labor, not with the flowery arts of written communication. It has some, you know, it's associated with manual labor, with custodians, food services, and being caught in cycles of low literacy, right? And so that model is still, I think, the dominant one in the field. I think that the salvation narrative, the progress narrative, has to do with attainment, to some degree, attainment of standardized American English. That's part of it, and then we could go beyond it, because we have those who have followed in the tradition of Freire, So there is a liberatory pedagogy that goes only so far. It's liberatory pedagogy as being able to mirror the political sentiments of one's professor, you know, and others have made that argument far better than I am right now. And so I think that there is a fairly reductive and damaging view of this of the progress narrative. So it's literacy as the cure-all, right? Literacy is and standardized American English, alphabetic literacy will lead the people into civilization. That was the earlier argument, and lead people into salvation, and also an earlier argument. That the rhetoric of modernity is still very much caught in those. The vocabulary words can shift. You know, your diction, you know, can shift. You can change it at the sentence level, but the theoretical grounding is still there. It's still present. It's very interesting. I think that we're better as a caucus. We are in a better position now to respond to that narrative of salvation. I think that we're in a much. I'm thinking about Iris Ruiz and some of her work, her book with Palgrave Macmillan, and then the edited collection that we'll hopefully be seeing out later this year or early next year. With Raul Sanchez, her co-edited book. I think that when we take that scholarship into account, we're actually in a far better place to offer a counter strike in response, a much more healthy response to those very easy and even, paternalizing salvation narratives. So I don't see us as being doomed to be necessarily complicit in that language. I suspect that the scholars who've come before us had fewer options available to them than we do now. I would say that the story of the Latino caucus is one of inclusivity and solidarity building, that's its strength, and that we are inclusive of a wide range of differences within the Latinao canvas, and that we are not threatened by the differences, that we actually see that as a strength, and that even the marker, this identity marker of Latina and Latino, or Latinao, or Latinx, or Latino with the arroba, that that multiplicity, that difference is not something to be erased under those mantles, but instead that those markers can be used as connectors across great difference. Doesn't the publication the publication itself would suggest sort of an editing out of difference, right? And I'm thinking about just very, very simple things, working with my own publications with Mestizo Scripts, and then following that up with Rhetorics of the Americas. It's a very fairly conventional practice that any word or phrase or expression that is not in English will appear in your book in italicized. It's in italics. And we can go back. There's been a debate about Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera with Antlut Books, because of course, as she engages in her multilingual, code switching and code entanglements and those linguistic innovations, blurring those borders, that if you're taking something that is not English and you're italicizing it, you're actually emphasizing a difference, right? You're not bridging across difference. You're making the difference more evident and more apparent to the reader. Well, this is a standard publication strategy, and so I faced it with my own 2 books, and it was not a battle that I was willing to fight. I fought other battles. So maybe there is some degree of complicity in some of our publications, and maybe in the future we might be able to collectively work toward making some significant changes. Right? I think the most important important thing for us to be thinking about now is how we can continue the fight for inclusivity and solidarity building. That there's too much at stake for us to squabble or to fight unnecessary fights with each other, because there is a time to engage in horizontal critique, I guess you could say, right? But we are also thinking collectively about the vertical, we're critiquing up, not across, so we are at a point, I think, where we can continue to continue our focus on critiquing up while working together for inclusivity, solidarity building, and that can look like different things. And sometimes I think I may be thinking of something very simple, and that is how we engage each other on the Latino Caucus listserv. Just how we're communicating with each other on the listserv. Email is I think, actually, I will be bold and say that email is not a great tool for solidarity building. That's a terribly unpopular thing to say, because we want to be thinking about the creation of community in digital environments, and that's important. But what I'm arguing is that if we're looking at email, that's actually not that helpful. And I'm thinking specifically about academics and the way academics use email. It hasn't been that healthy. And so I think that maybe we need to pause when we're thinking about how we're using it as a tool. Which is more important, to be right all the time and argumentative and right, or to exist in coalition with others? Oh, well, of course you should have asked me all about my book. This has been great. This has been good.
Okay. So we're actually done with the interview. If you have anything else you want to add, you can. Well, thank you, Dr. Baca, for joining us today and adding to this history of the Latino Caucus. It's been great to hear about the idea of inclusivity and solidarity building, which I think is very important as well. And I hope to see that in the near future as well.